My wife's betrayal went far deeper than I could have imagined. She planned to erase me entirely. With the help of the man I once called a friend, she wanted my children, my fortune, and even my name. But the game they were playing had rules they didn't understand, because I was the one who wrote them. And before this was over, they would learn exactly what that meant. Have you ever faced a betrayal so profound it forced you to fight for everything that mattered? Share your thoughts below. Your story might just remind someone that integrity can still win in the end. My name is Troy Blackstone. I'm 46 years old, and this is the story of how I turned the greatest betrayal of my life into my fight for truth, justice, and my children. The dim light of his basement office surrounded Troy Blackstone, the huge hum of servers filling the silence around him. On one monitor, a high-definition video played on a loop, surveillance footage he had extracted from Diana's supposedly encrypted laptop. In a hotel suite that screamed wealth, she was draped across a velvet armchair, laughing as Blake Hoffman poured champagne into her glass. Everything he needed to know was told by the soundless footage. The way her head tilted back, the way her hand lingered on Blake's arm, the way Blake leaned in to whisper something that made her smile like a woman who believed she'd already won. On her wrist was a diamond bracelet Troy hadn't bought, one that glinted under the soft hotel lighting as she lifted her glass. Blake's lips moved, and even without audio, Troy could read the words. A new life. For a long moment, he stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. 8 years of marriage, reduced to pixels. Diana had always been ambitious, but this was more than ambition. This was calculation. Screens were switched, and Troy pulled up a folder he had decrypted the night before. Each file was a nail in the coffin of the life he thought they had built together. Encrypted text messages between Diana and Blake scrolled across the monitor, their words cold and deliberate. Blake had written, "The prenup won't matter if we can prove he's been using company resources for surveillance. Your mother's connections will guarantee you full custody." Diana's reply was worse than anything Troy had prepared himself to see. "Connor and Madison barely know him anyway. He chose work over family years ago. We'll make sure they understand that." Slowly, Troy exhaled as he leaned back in his chair. In his line of work, he had been betrayed before. Colleagues selling confidential data, clients withholding truths. But this was different. This was personal. They weren't just cheating on him. They were rewriting his life, turning him into a villain in his children's eyes, erasing all the years he had sacrificed to keep his family safe and cared for. In his mind, he replayed Diana's messages, each word cutting deeper than the footage of her with Blake. She wasn't just leaving him. She was orchestrating his destruction with the same precision she once used to close million-dollar real estate deals. His eyes drifted around the basement office, and for the first time, he really looked at his own home. Upstairs, the brownstone was filled with designer furniture Diana had chosen, art pieces she had hung, rugs she had insisted on importing from Italy. None of it reflected him. Not the man who had grown up in foster care, who had built his business from nothing, who valued function over flash. Even the family photos in the hallway had been arranged by her, carefully curated moments that looked perfect but felt hollow to him now. He wondered how much of their marriage had been genuine and how much had been a performance for the world, for Blake, for her powerful family. Troy turned back to the screen, his jaw tightening not with rage, but with resolve. Rage was for amateurs, for people who reacted without thinking. His entire career had been built on never reacting, only acting with precision. If Diana and Blake wanted to turn this into a game of strategy, they had chosen the wrong opponent. He switched off the monitor, and the room fell into a deeper silence. Methodically, his hands moved, pulling a thick folder from the locked drawer of his desk. Inside were bank statements, property records, and investigative files he had been compiling for months, long before he even confirmed the affair. He had suspected something was wrong, and as always, his instincts had been right. Diana had trusted him with everything financial. She had never paid attention to the details, never questioned the documents he put in front of her. That trust, the one part of their marriage she had never doubted, was about to become her most expensive mistake. Placing the folder on the desk, Troy opened it to the first page. His reflection stared back from the glossy photograph clipped to the top. A picture of Diana and Blake together at a charity gala months ago, smiling for the cameras while they plotted his downfall behind the scenes. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all, The loss of the woman he thought he knew, the betrayal from a man he once called a friend, the threat to his children's future. Then, just as quickly, he buried it. This wasn't the time for emotions. This was preparation, and preparation was what he did best. He closed the folder, his expression hardening into the same quiet determination that had made him one of the most respected security consultants in the city. Diana and Blake had made their move. Now it was his turn. Back in 2013, before life became a maze of distrust and whispered accusations, Troy Bennett was a man still trying to adjust to civilian life. After 12 years in military intelligence, he had traded covert operations for the quieter but equally intense world of corporate security consulting. That's when he met Diana Clark, a dazzling real estate developer who seemed to light up every room she entered. Fast, almost reckless, was their connection. Troy wasn't the type to believe in love at first sight, but Diana's confidence, her ambition, and the way she carried herself pulled him in. Within a year, they were married. Friends called it impulsive. His military buddies warned him that people who rise too quickly in high society circles are often driven by something other tthan love. But Troy didn't care. He believed he'd found someone who saw the man behind the uniform. 3 years later, the twins arrived. Connor and Madison, bright-eyed reminders of why Troy fought so hard to build a stable life. For a while, it seemed perfect. Diana was climbing the social ladder. Troy was securing contracts with high-profile clients. And both of them were building the life they had dreamed about. Scene 2, Troy's dedication. What Diana never fully understood was the cost of Troy's dedication. Corporate security consulting wasn't just risk assessments and polished presentations. It was late-night calls, emergency extractions for executives traveling overseas, and long hours tracking potential threats for companies too arrogant to believe they were vulnerable. He juggled it all, rarely complaining. His nights often ended in his home office reviewing surveillance data, while Diana attended charity galas or business networking dinners. He told himself it was fine. She was building her brand, and he was protecting theirs. Every time he tucked Connor and Madison into bed after returning from a trip, he promised himself he'd be there more often. But the lifestyle his work provided was something Diana thrived on. She loved the dinners at private clubs, the invitations to exclusive events, and the quiet acknowledgement among her peers that she was married to someone who mattered. Scene 3, the first cracks. The first cracks weren't loud arguments or obvious betrayals. They were subtle. Late-night phone calls Diana didn't explain, hushed conversations when Troy entered the room, and an increasing number of business trips she took alone. At first, Troy ignored it. He was trained to observe patterns, but he wanted to believe the woman he loved was still the same one who held his hand in the hospital when Connor was born prematurely. But by 2019, things had shifted. Diana's charm had become calculated. She spent more time with people Troy didn't know, powerful investors and developers who seemed more interested in her than the projects she pitched. She grew colder toward Troy, often criticizing the long hours he worked, as if forgetting that those same hours funded her carefully curated lifestyle. Troy, ever the soldier, tried to fight for their marriage with quiet consistency. More family dinners, more time coaching Connor's little league team, and reading bedtime stories to Madison, even when he was exhausted. But every gesture felt like throwing pebbles into a storm. By late 2020, even his friends noticed. One night while grabbing a drink with an old army buddy, Troy finally admitted, "I can track a threat from 2 miles out, but I can't figure out what's happening in my own home." What he didn't know then was that Diana's ambition was about to cross a line he never imagined she'd step over. The real turning point began on a quiet Sunday morning when Troy sat alone in his home office, sifting through public records. Years of military intelligence work had taught him one thing: patterns never lie. Diana's sudden aggression in their marriage, her family's growing interference, and the smug confidence she carried these days were not random. There was a deeper play, and Troy was finally ready to uncover it. The smoking gun came buried in sealed family court documents obtained through a private source who still owed Troy a favor. As Troy scrolled through the scanned files, his jaw tightened. The case was from 13 years ago, an incident involving Diana's mother, Judge Patricia Harrison. The official record stated that Patricia had dismissed a drunk driving charge against a young political donor's son, citing insufficient evidence. But the sealed files told the real story. The driver had been Patricia's own nephew. His reckless speeding had killed an immigrant family of 4. But Patricia's influence had buried the truth under legal jargon and sealed testimonies. Staring at the screen, Troy sat back. This wasn't just an ethical lapse. It was career-ending corruption. Diana had always idolized her mother's power in the legal world. But now that power was a loaded gun, one Troy could aim in the right direction if he chose. He didn't stop there. For 2 weeks, he quietly built a case, piecing together financial records, campaign contributions, and photographs. Gregory Harrison, Diana's father, was no innocent bystander. A paper trail connected him to strategic donations funneled to the district attorney's re-election campaign just days after the case was sealed. The Harrisons had built their entire public image on integrity and family values, but Troy now held the proof of the rot beneath it. As he compiled the evidence, he remained methodical, not emotional. Every document was cross-referenced. Every photo was time-stamped. Every financial transfer was verified by independent records. Troy knew how fragile leverage could be if it wasn't airtight, and this had to be bulletproof. By the time he was done, the file was thick with undeniable proof. One call to the right journalist or federal investigator would destroy the Harrisons' reputation forever. But Troy wasn't reckless. He didn't want to humiliate Deanna publicly. Not yet. His goal was control, not chaos. So he waited, letting Deanna and her lawyer make the first move. That moment arrived sooner than expected. A week later, Troy sat across from Lawrence Keir, a high-priced family attorney known for his arrogance. With the kind of smug smile only men like him seemed to perfect, Lawrence slid a thick packet across the polished conference table. "Sign these," Lawrence said, leaning back in his chair. "Diana will retain full custody of the twins. She'll also keep the house, the vehicles, and a majority of your consulting business profits. It's in everyone's best interest to make this clean. Otherwise, we'll litigate aggressively, and I can assure you, Troy, you will lose." Troy didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Instead, he picked up the papers, glanced at them briefly, and then sat them down as if they were nothing more than junk mail. His calm, unnerved Lawrence, who shifted slightly in his chair, waiting for an anger that never came. Troy reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a single envelope, placing it neatly on the table. His voice was quiet, measured, every word deliberate. "Deliver this to your client." Lawrence frowned, hesitating for the first time. "What is this?" "Just deliver it," Troy replied, his gaze steady. "Tell Diana to read it before she decides how aggressive she really wants to be." Inside the envelope was a neatly organized summary of the Harrison family's darkest secrets. It included copies of the sealed court records, financial statements tracing Gregory's payments, and photographs of Patricia meeting privately with the district attorney weeks before the case was dismissed. The implication was clear. Push this divorce too far, and the Harrisons would lose everything they had spent decades building. Slowly, Troy stood, gathering his things without another word. His calmness filled the room like a weight Lawrence couldn't shake. The lawyer stared at the envelope as if it might explode. As Troy walked out, his mind was steady, focused. For the first time in months, the balance of power had shifted. Diana thought she had cornered him, but now every move she made would have to account for the quiet storm he had just unleashed. The first call came just after midnight. Troy sat in his study, the house quiet except for the hum of his laptop. Diana's name flashed across his phone screen. He let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, it rang again. This time it was Blake Harrison, her brother, and the self-appointed family enforcer. Troy ignored that one, too, leaning back in his chair with the same calm he had carried into Lawrence Keir's office earlier that day. The third call came less than 5 minutes later. "Patricia Harrison," he answered. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice sharp, but carrying a thread of unease. Patricia was used to intimidation, but now it trembled at the edges. Troy spoke evenly, his tone clipped and deliberate. "Justice." There was silence on the line. Patricia inhaled slowly, then exhaled as if weighing every word. "You think you can threaten me with half-baked accusations?" "They're not accusations," Troy replied. "They're records. Sealed court documents, financial transfers, photographs. You've spent years keeping the Moretti family buried under lies, but the truth is still out there. You know it, and now so do I." Patricia's voice softened, almost pleading. "What do you want, Troy?" "I want 3 things," he said without hesitation. Diana withdraws the divorce petition immediately and signs full custody of Connor and Madison over to me. Blake sells his share of Bennett Security Solutions back to me at the original valuation, not the inflated number he tried to extort. And you resign from the bench quietly before the federal investigators get to you first. Fail to do any of this, and the Moretti family finally gets justice. I'll make sure every journalist in this city has what they need to blow this open. Patricia didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. You're bluffing. Troy's answer was calm and final. You already know I'm not. He hung up before she could respond, leaving her in silence. By morning, the cracks in the Harrison family's armor were already beginning to show. Troy had sent no direct threats to the media, but he had made sure that an anonymous tip, complete with vague but enticing details about the Moretti case, landed in the inboxes of 3 investigative journalists. He also sent a carefully redacted version of the financial records to a contact at the federal prosecutor's office. It wasn't enough to confirm the entire scandal, but it was enough to raise questions the Harrisons couldn't afford. Blake was the first to panic. By late afternoon, he left a furious voicemail, his voice cracking as he shouted that Troy was destroying everything. He called again an hour later, this time begging for a meeting. Troy didn't answer. Diana's resolve broke next. She showed up at Troy's office unannounced, her designer jacket wrinkled, her usual composure slipping. You're ruining us, she said, trying to sound angry, but her tone betrayed fear. Do you even care what this will do to Connor and Madison? Troy stared at her for a long moment before answering. I care about them more than anyone in your family ever has. That's why I'm doing this. By evening, the story had begun to grow legs. News outlets hinted at a long-buried judicial cover-up involving a respected judge. Online forums speculated about corruption in the Harrison family. And for the first time in her career, Patricia skipped her scheduled court session. She knew Troy wasn't bluffing, and she knew the clock was running out. The tension in Lawrence Keir's office was suffocating. Troy sat at the far end of the table, his posture relaxed, while Diana sat stiffly across from him, her hands trembling as she gripped a pen. The thick stack of documents in front of her represented everything she had fought for: control, custody, wealth, and she was about to sign it all away. Lawrence, usually smug and confident, looked pale and distracted, his gaze fixed on the tabletop as if he wanted to be anywhere but there. Are we doing this or not? Troy asked calmly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Diana glared at him, but the fight in her eyes was gone. Her mother had gone silent after Troy's ultimatum. Blake had refused to even show up, and federal investigators had begun making quiet inquiries into the Harrison family's finances. Every advantage she thought she had was gone. She lowered her eyes and scribbled her name at the bottom of the custody agreement, then the business transfer, and finally the property settlement. Each signature felt like another brick pulled from the empire she had tried to build. When she finished, she pushed the documents across the table. You win, she said bitterly. Troy didn't move to take them right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. No, Diana, this isn't about winning. This is about truth. So before we finish, you're going to say it. Why you did all of this? She stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was headed. Troy stayed silent, waiting. Finally, Diana slammed the pen onto the table and snapped. You want the truth? Fine. You were never good enough for me, she spat. I married you because you were useful, because you had money, connections, and a name people respected. But you were just a security grunt pretending to be something bigger. I outgrew you years ago. Troy listened without flinching. When she was finished, he gave a slow nod. And yet I just took everything you valued. Diana's face flushed red, but she said nothing. Her breathing was shallow, almost shaky. Troy finally gathered the signed documents and slipped them into his leather folder. But before standing, he pulled out another envelope and set it in front of her. What's this? She asked, her voice wary. Consider it a gift, Troy said. She opened the envelope and froze. Inside were photographs. Blake Harrison boarding a private jet with a woman half his age, their hands intertwined. Another shot showed Blake withdrawing large sums of cash from a Cayman Islands account registered in both his and Diana's names. The final photo captured him lounging on a yacht, champagne in hand, already celebrating his escape. Diana's hand trembled as she flipped through the images. This isn't real, she whispered, though her voice cracked with the weight of realization. It's real, Troy said evenly. Blake drained the accounts 2 days ago. By now, he's probably in Monaco. Whatever he promised you, it's gone, just like everything else. Diana's composure finally shattered. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, a muffled sob escaping her lips. For a moment, the room was silent, except for her quiet breakdown. Lawrence looked away, uncomfortable, but Troy didn't move. He simply stood, slid the folder under his arm, and turned toward the door. Without looking back, he said one last thing. You wanted power, Diana. Now you have nothing left to fight for. He left her there, the signed agreements on the table and the weight of her own choices crushing her far more effectively than anything he could have said. The public reckoning came faster than even Troy expected. Within a week of Diana signing the final agreements, Patricia Harrison announced her resignation from the bench. The statement she released to the press cited personal health reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The leaked court records were now part of a growing federal inquiry, and whispers about the Moretti family case had begun dominating local news cycles. What had once been a tightly controlled narrative of integrity and service was unraveling in real time. Gregory Harrison's hotel empire, long considered untouchable, became the next casualty. Federal investigators, armed with Troy's evidence, quietly froze several of his key accounts under suspicion of money laundering and campaign finance violations. Investors began pulling out, and stock values dropped overnight. The Moretti family, now empowered by a team of civil attorneys, filed lawsuits that tied up nearly every major Harrison asset. Decades of cultivated influence and wealth were collapsing under the weight of the truth. And Troy hadn't spoken a single word to the media. He didn't need to. The truth, once freed, did its own damage. Diana's downfall was quieter, but no less final. The divorce withdrawal and custody agreement had left her financially cornered, and Blake's theft of their shared accounts ensured she had no safety net. Within months, she was forced to sell her luxury cars and the few personal investments she still controlled just to stay afloat. The high society invitations that once defined her life vanished. People who had once fawned over her stopped returning her calls. Eventually, she took a position as a mid-level real estate agent in a smaller suburban firm. There were no charity galas, no luxury penthouses to boast about, just open houses and commission-based paychecks. Occasionally, Troy would hear about her through mutual acquaintances. She was polite, they said, even humbled, though her pride still showed in the way she carried herself. But for the first time in years, Diana no longer had any real power to wield. She existed on the edges now, far from the life she had once sacrificed everything to control. Blake Harrison, however, was not allowed to fade into quiet obscurity. Troy had made sure of that through contacts he still had from his military intelligence days. Troy provided investigators with detailed information about Blake's offshore accounts and the fraudulent business transactions he had orchestrated. Within weeks, Blake's assets were frozen and his name appeared on an international watch list. He fled from country to country, but every move narrowed his options further. The woman he had fled overseas with left him the moment his money became inaccessible. By the time the news outlets caught wind of his downfall, Blake was described as a fugitive, living in temporary rentals under assumed names. His reputation in both business and social circles was destroyed. Troy didn't celebrate any of it. Sitting in his home office late at night, he would sometimes think about how easily he could have let his anger dictate every step. How tempting it had been to crush them purely out of revenge. But this was never about spite. It had always been about balance, ensuring that those who had destroyed others for their own gain finally faced consequences. The Harrisons had built their power on lies, and now those lies had consumed them. For Troy, justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, methodical, and final. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. 3 months later, the world felt different for Troy Bennett. On a warm Saturday afternoon, he stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing as he watched Connor and Madison chase each other across the backyard. Their laughter filled the air, bright and unburdened, a sound he hadn't heard so freely in months. They didn't understand the full scope of what had happened, the legal battles, the threats, or the quiet war he had waged to protect them. All they knew was that their father had fought for them, and that was enough. Connor stopped to catch his breath, his cheeks flushed from running. while Madison squealed and darted toward the swings. Troy smiled to himself, a quiet pride settling in his chest. This was why he had endured every sleepless night, why he had chosen strategy over rage. He hadn't fought for revenge. He had fought for this simple, peaceful moment. Life had shifted in other ways, too. Blackstone Security, the firm he had built before the Harrisons tried to strip it from him, was thriving again. News of the Harrison scandal had spread through the corporate world, and clients who once hesitated to sign with him now lined up for contracts. His reputation, already solid, was stronger than ever. Troy had expanded his operations, hiring a new team of trusted former colleagues, and he'd found himself turning down more work than he accepted. But he didn't bury himself in it the way he once had. Late nights staring at security feeds had been replaced with family dinners, school projects, and evenings teaching Connor to throw a baseball. Troy had also learned to let go of anger. He could have pursued the Harrisons further, could have ensured every last piece of their influence was destroyed. But he had already accomplished what mattered most. Patricia was disgraced. Gregory's empire was under scrutiny. Blake was a fugitive. And Diana was no longer a threat. She was just another person trying to rebuild from the ruins of her own choices. Inside his office, a single photograph remained on the shelf. It was of Diana, taken years ago back when they were still a family. Troy kept it not out of lingering love or nostalgia, but as a reminder. Trust, he had learned, was not something to give away freely. It was something to be earned carefully and never taken for granted. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Troy stepped off the porch and joined his children in the yard. Connor tossed him the baseball and Madison cheered when he caught it easily. For the first time in years, Troy felt like the ground beneath him was solid. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his, earned through patience, sacrifice, and a quiet determination to protect what truly mattered. Some betrayals try to take everything from you, but sometimes they leave you with exactly what you need.